So, with pleasure, let me welcome the first presenter in the session, Cadet Kayla. You have 15 minutes, please.
First of all, thanks everyone for coming today and allowing me to speak at this conference. It's an opportunity that undergraduate students don't usually have, so I appreciate it. My topic concerns German Southwest Africa in 1904, which is considered the first genocide of the 20th century, being the Herero genocide. Now, by 1911, census records showed that a population that originally was perhaps 60,000 to 80,000 Hereros drastically decreased to 15,000. And historians, and even Germany itself, as evident in the belated apology rendered in 2004, have recognized that what happened actually was a genocide. Most historians also recognize that General Lothar von Trotha was the instigator of the genocide. However, his take no prisoners policy did not occur in a vacuum, nor did it occur in secret. Someone had to give the okay, and someone should have spoken out. Now, it probably comes as no surprise that the German settlers who were personally affected, or the Kaiser who has been considered possibly mentally imbalanced, gave their consent to Trotha's genocidal policy. What made me scratch my head was the fact that the Reichstag, which was the German parliament, and which had a huge reputation as being very anti-imperial, very anti-colonial, did not speak out. I saw three possible explanations for this phenomenon. First, they might have been ignorant of what was going on in Southwest Africa. Second, they might have disapproved but chosen not to speak out, perhaps for fear of repercussions to their career. Or third, they might have approved of the genocidal actions, and I think that evidence supports this third possibility. Horrified by the perceived guerrilla tactics employed in the Herero rebellion, the Reichstag consented to punishment of what we today might call terrorists. Now, it's peculiar that the Reichstag gave their silent consent for so long, because of all the political authorities in Berlin, it would have been the Reichstag to speak out. After the elections of 1903, the most highly represented parties in the Reichstag were the Social Democrats, or SPD, and the Catholic Center Party with about 100 seats, and the SPD had about 81. The Polish Party also had 16 seats, and these three parties tended to vote in a bloc. All three of the parties embodied anti-imperial sentiment. The SPD had a long record of morally condemning colonialism, the Center adopted a critical approach, and the Poles naturally were hostile to the Kaiser because he had suppressed their language and culture. Even before the start of the Herero rebellion, certain individuals within these three parties had forged reputations for themselves as being anti-imperial, with the most famous of these being August Bebel. He was the party patriarch of the SPD, and his name carried anti-imperial connotations for decades. He deemed flogging a form of torture, and in 1906 judged colonial uprisings no surprise given German injustice. What then made him say, quote, "I have not held a speech in favor of the Hereros. I have repeatedly emphasized that they are a wild people, very low in culture." Why the defensive antagonism? Bebel needn't have feared repercussions to his career. As the governing body in control of the imperial budget, the Reichstag served as a forum for debate and discussion. Yet no one debated for the Hereros until months after Trotha declared his genocidal policy. In the minds of many, innocence is a prerequisite for victim status. But now, by virtue of the rebellion, its unexpectedness, its unconventional tactics, its inclusion of Herero women as combatants, and its level of success, particularly in the spring of 1904, the Hereros were not innocent in the minds of the Reichstag. Perceptions of these aforementioned four damning factors caused German eyewitness accounts to exaggerate, reproduce, and disseminate rumors of the rebellion to the point at which normal human psychological responses demanded a departure from reason. The Herero rebellion was declared without prior warning by a man who had been put into power by Germany. It was German intervention that had given Samuel Herero his position as paramount chief of Herero land, a position that until then did not really exist in Herero culture, which recognized no one unified voice over all of the tribes. German colonial authorities fabricated this idea in order to facilitate the signing of their treaties. And even amongst those Herero who didn't hate Samuel, The treaties didn't help much because they were written in German, which a lot of the chiefs didn't understand, and a lot of the chiefs also didn't receive copies of the treaties. So what you see is that the Germans had been ignorant, either willfully or otherwise, of the level of Herero discontent. In the year 1900, the land asked of the Hereros seemed paltry in comparison to the land that had already been given up by other tribes. So the German sense of betrayal when the rebellion suddenly exploded in 1904 contributed to their sense that the Hereros weren't playing by their rules. The Hereros' unconventional tactics fanned the flame lit by betrayal. Herero warriors did seek to make use of the element of surprise rather than a conventional infantry versus infantry front-on-front out in the open battle. When surprise attacks on military targets were not possible, the Hereros resorted to surprise attacks on the settler population. In January of 1904 at Okpeh town, Herero spurned the German fort, opting instead to plunder settlers' homes and shops in the night and set them on fire. Now I want to clarify that the only widespread attacks of Hereros upon the helpless were their mutilation of German corpses. Now the horror inspired in German witnesses in a culture, the German culture, that regarded even stripping clothes from the dead as mutilation should not be underestimated. Sometimes what was perceived as mutilation was just the natural damage caused by Kiri clubs, which were close-quarter weapons, but other times mutilation came in the form of castration, particularly acts of revenge of rape by those German men against Herero women. Speaking of women, Germans recoiled at the participation of Herero women in the rebellion. There exist documented instances of Herero women hiding in the bush around certain battles, cheering on their men, with such phrases as, "Who owns this land? You own this land." German soldiers witnessed these fanatically cheering women at the Battle of Oganjira on April 9, 1904. Perhaps the women's encouragement helped. More likely, it was the German inability to predict when a Herero attack would come, from where, and by whom, that contributed to Herero battle successes in the spring of 1904. Civilian casualties on the German side of the Herero rebellion included 123 settlers, primarily adult males, killed during 267 attacks on farms and shops. Quote, "More blood was shed in the desert and in the bush than in any war on German soil since the Napoleonic invasions." These losses, compounded by typhoid and contaminated or less access to water supply, caused the Germans' entire eastern contingent to be dissolved. So not only was the Herero War unconventional, but it was also effective, which caused Germany to begin to panic. The transmittal of such accounts of these unconventional tactics necessarily debunks a counter-argument I mentioned in my introduction, which is that the Reichstag maybe didn't speak out because they were ignorant. This couldn't have been true because, first of all, Governor Lothar and General Trotha frequently sent written reports to the Colonial Department of the Foreign Office. Second, soldiers wrote letters home all the time. Some of these letters were even addressed to members of the Reichstag, most likely because it was impossible to get a commission in the expeditionary forces without some kind of connections to the higher-ups. A lot of the letters were published as propaganda, so they circulated throughout the German population. Southwest Africa was a hotly debated topic in newspapers and even works of fiction novels. The sheer volume of information transmission from Southwest Africa to Berlin served as the vector for settler hysteria. Settlers indulged in rumor and hyperbole, and imperial authorities fell prey to stress-induced panic. Regardless of whether these unconventional tactics actually happened to the extent that they said they were, or not, it's perception that matters at the point where the Reichstag was 5,000 miles away from what was actually happening. Early in the rebellion, Dr. Stubel of the Colonial Department, quote, could only report that the German garrisons were desperately assailed. Because the telegraph lines had been cut very early on in the rebellion, the Reichstag members were relying much upon rumor and fear. Feelings of doubt, helplessness, and desperation, the need to help one's fellow countrymen, prompted the imperial government to sacrifice humanitarian standards for a solution that would work. Lothar von Trotha, the infamously brutal veteran of Sudan, East Africa, and the Boxer Rebellion, seemed to be that solution. Now, educational, societal, and international norms teach us that genocide is wrong and we must reject it in all its forms. Yet, is it not human nature to feel terror in the face of terror? How can a human being control his or her instinctual, subconscious, natural, psychological reaction to having his or her life threatened by an enemy who They cannot pinpoint or predict a cruel enemy perceived to have sinned against the most basic humanitarian laws of war. If we cannot find an answer, we will be the next August Bebels of our generation. And when the next unconventional attack comes, will we silently watch genocide unfold? Thanks for listening to me, and I'll now take your questions.
You will sit down. There will be time for questions. But what I want the audience to note about this presentation is the context of the Herero genocide in 1904. That's very, very important. And international views on the matter. The second issue you should also note is the involvement of women in terms of what that will generate at the level of gender matters as you discuss international genocide and all that. Given the period it occurred, because it occurred at a very early period, some of these issues have bearing with subsequent genocides. You need to interrogate that when you ask your questions, because these are issues that I think will form a robust debate. You just note that. We'll call on the second person to quickly just give us his own paper. You just move on. He's doing a paper, that's Aaron Linderman. He's doing a paper on Afrikaner influence on the IRA and the SOE. You have 10 minutes. 15 minutes. 15 minutes to present. Sorry. Please go on. Yeah.
This paper considers how the Irish Republican Army and the Special Operations Executive were inspired by the South African War of 1899 to 1902. Although Irish admiration for the Afrikaners is widely acknowledged, most accounts focus on political issues or highlight Irish volunteers who fought for the Afrikaners rather than considering the influence of the Afrikaners on the tactics of the Irish Republican Army. Even less studied are the doctrinal origins of SOE, at which previous scholarship has only hinted. While the Afrikaners were only one of several inspirations to both the IRA and the SOE, this paper explores that inspiration. So I will consider in turn the Afrikaner practice of guerrilla warfare, then IRA developments, SOE developments, and then a few concluding remarks. With the fall of the Afrikaner capitals in 1900, many in London assumed the South African War was over. Instead, Britain faced a guerrilla war in which Afrikaner commandos lived off the land and local Afrikaner farms, striking swiftly and disappearing into the veldt. For 2 years, the war carried on this way until peace in 1902. The guerrillas understood the importance of survival. So long as they remained in the field, the British could not claim victory. General Christian de Witt commented that it was impossible to think of fighting. The enemy's numbers were far too great. Our only safety lay in flight. By appearing first at one place and then another, they forced the British to guard vast tracts of territories, tying down huge numbers of troops. Surprise and deception were frequently employed by the guerrillas. At Blood River Port, Colonel Hubert Gough, for example, attacked a body of dismounted Afrikaners, caught, he believed, unprepared. In fact, it was a trap, with General Louis Botha's main force flanking Gough and rolling over the British line in 10 minutes. Effective intelligence allowed the Afrikaners to strike where the enemy was weakest. To this end, they tapped the British telegraph lines, while every farm was used as an intelligence agency. To deal with spies and informers in their own midst, the Afrikaners expelled those suspected of disloyalty and executed those found guilty of treason. Spying for the British, explained one British agent, was dangerous work, as the Boers killed any caught, and we found their bodies left as a warning on the veldt. Commandos relied on captured equipment and supplies. Sometimes the supply situation could become quite desperate. In one engagement, General Smuts' men literally fired their last rounds and then took up the weapons of the fallen British. Surviving off enemy goods had its advantages. Captured uniforms allowed Afrikaners to pose as British soldiers. This was, however, a violation of the accepted norms of war. While there was some justification for wearing the British uniforms, notes historian Byron Farwell, there was no excuse for not removing the badges and insignia, and there was no excuse for not discarding the uniforms when civilian clothing became available. Finally, the Afrikaners made frequent use of civilians, depending on them for food, intelligence, and concealment. Such use of civilians was not, however, without cost. Burning farms was a routine British practice, and women and children were rounded up and placed in concentration camps where they died in appalling numbers. Moving then to the Irish. Arthur Griffith, future founder of the nationalist Sinn Féin party, traveled to the Transvaal in 1897 and 1898. He came to admire the Afrikaners and was affirmed in his belief that God Almighty had not made the earth for the sole use of the Anglo-Saxon race. In the midst of the South African War, when the British Army was extremely popular at home, only Irish nationalists openly cheered Afrikaner victories. The Gaelic Athletic Association passed resolutions supporting the Afrikaners, named clubs after Afrikaner generals, and discouraged Irishmen from joining the British Army. The association secretary argued that sooner or later Irishmen would adopt Boer tactics, and the sooner the better. In 1899, Griffith founded the Irish Transvaal Committee to support the Afrikaners. But by the autumn of 1901, he decided to nationalize the organization, and in September he founded Cumann an Gaedhil, the Society of the Gaels, drawing mostly upon the Transvaal Committee's membership. In 1905, Cumann an Gaedhil morphed into Sinn Féin, which declared itself the Parliament of Ireland in 1919 and had strongly interlocking membership with the Irish Republican Army. The Afrikaner connection to the Irish was particularly tangible through the Irish Transvaal Brigade, raised from Irishmen and Irish Americans in September 1899. The Irishman John McBride had a hand in its creation, though an Irish American, John Blake, commanded it. The men of the brigade keenly sensed that their work in South Africa supported the struggle in Ireland. Blake explained, "I accepted the command on the condition that all would fight purely for their love of liberty and for downtrodden Ireland." Historian Donald McCracken comments that the Irish fought well, but it would be naive to imagine they affected the fortunes of the war. Their impact on later Irish history, however, is more significant. When McBride scandalously divorced in 1905, one commentator insisted, "For the sake of the country, the McBride legend must keep its luster." McBride and the Irish Transvaal Brigade had become cultural institutions, parts of the Republican story. In 1911, McBride was elected to the Supreme Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, another organization in bed with Sinn Féin and the IRA, with the other leaders mindful that one day McBride's military knowledge and reputation might be of value. In 1913, he was offered a seat on the board of the new Irish National Volunteers, which would become the Irish Republican Army. In the 1916 Easter Rising, he served as executive officer of the 2nd Battalion. When the Rising failed and McBride was captured, his leadership in the Irish Brigade in South Africa did not endear him to his British captors, who executed him. In subsequent years, the Irish took a curious confidence from the Afrikaner example. The Afrikaner defeat was seen as a kind of victory, exacting a huge price in men and material and revealing the limits of British power. Thus, in 1921, Florence O'Donoghue, an IRA intelligence officer, could write that the British next move will be to try and round up and intern all the active spirits of the IRA. For this purpose, 8,000 troops are being sent to carry out large-scale drives. This plan was also adopted by England in the South African War. It was not successful there. It will not succeed here. Irish appeals to Afrikaner tactics were common. Arthur Lynch, a volunteer who fought in South Africa, considered the Afrikaners a model in the training of a soldier for Ireland. O'Donoghue wrote to his wife in 1921, "I have been reading DeWitt's 3 Years' War most of the day." In spite of the attention that DeWitt and others received in Ireland, J.J. O'Connell, who promoted unconventional warfare among the IRA, rejected the model of the Afrikaners. He writes, "Our differences from the Boers were much more numerous and far-reaching than our resemblances to them. General DeWitt's 3 Years' War was advocated as a textbook, but anyone who has read that book cannot fail to recall how frequently the general laments the almost incredible indiscipline of his troops. It was in spite of, not because of, their lack of drill that the Boers achieved so many tactical victories." DeWitt's account confirms this assessment. He complains often the great fault of the burghers was their disobedience. But could lessons be learned in spite of this lack of discipline and eventual defeat? Though O'Connell hated the analogy, there were reasons why his colleagues took to it. Like the Afrikaners, the IRA prized survival. General Neville Macready, the British commander in Ireland, argued that the IRA never attempt an attack without a numerical superiority of not less than 20-1. Just as the Afrikaners stretched the British thin, so one British official explained, "We have been fighting on a hopelessly extended front, with our local post offices, income tax offices, and individual members of every branch of the civil administration scattered all over the country, an easy prey to the enemy, who has taken toll of them at will." IRA intelligence was quite effective, and not only at collection. What fate awaited enemy informers? They were killed, and the body was left about. On the victim's breast was pinned a piece of paper bearing the words, "Spies and informers beware, by order IRA." Thus, the corpses served as a warning to would-be spies, as had British corpses left on the veldt. Like the Afrikaners, the IRA relied on captured equipment and made extensive use of civilians who, like their Afrikaner counterparts, paid a high price for this role. Finally, Special Operations Executive. In 1939, a British officer named Colin Gubbins began examining guerrilla warfare and its application in future war in Europe. He and his colleagues looked for inspiration to Boer tactics in South Africa, to T.E. Lawrence and his partners, to the Russian Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, the struggle between China and Japan, the smoldering Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine, and of course, Ireland. As a result, Gubbins authored The Art of Guerrilla Warfare and the Partisan Leader's Handbook, which resonate with the Afrikaner themes. In 1940, the Special Operations Executive was created to support the resistance in Nazi-occupied Europe. Gubbins was given responsibility for training and operations, so it is little surprise that the SOE training syllabus echoes Gubbins' earlier writings. In 1942, he became deputy director, and in 1943, director of SOE, a post he held until the end of the war. Gubbins was keenly aware of the countermeasures guerrillas would face. He expected the enemy to possess armament superior in both quantity and quality, and to employ raids, traps, regulations such as the use of identity cards, and a variety of agents. Such measures echoed the British actions Gubbins had seen in Ireland, but also paralleled conditions in South Africa decades before. When martial law was imposed across Cape Colony in 1901, passes were required to enter, leave, or move from a district. A curfew was imposed, bicycles were registered, hotels had to file daily reports on their guests, and there were harsh restrictions on a long list of prohibited items. Gubbins knew that if guerrillas could not contend with countermeasures such as these, they would fail. Thus, he stressed survival, warning guerrillas to never get involved in a pitched battle. As in South Africa, he argued that guerrillas should compel the enemy to disperse his forces in order to guard his flank, his communications, his detachments, supply depots, etc. Good intelligence was stressed, and for those who passed information to the enemy, Gubbins recommended the severest measures. Immediately on proof of guilt, they must be killed, and if possible, a note pinned on the body stating that the man was an informer. Like the Irish and the Afrikaners before him, Gubbins also included civilians in the guerrilla war effort. But in spite of these similarities, Gubbins departed from his Afrikaner inspiration on several points. The ill discipline seen in O'Connell's comment was mirrored at higher levels. The Afrikaners had no overall strategy, no master plan for winning the war. The activities of the various commandos were not coordinated, and there was not even a statement of policy regarding purposes or objectives. To rectify this problem, Gubbins proposed the creation of a guerrilla bureau, which would coordinate plans, compile intelligence, and provide arms to guerrillas. Unlike the Afrikaners, Gubbins nowhere recommended posing as enemy soldiers. Instead, he was committed to upholding international norms and conventions. Finally, Gubbins would only conduct a guerrilla campaign with hope of success. Sporadic risings, he writes, are useless. it is curious that an unsuccessful guerrilla campaign, that waged by the Afrikaners, should inspire two successful campaigns, one by the IRA against the British and one by the British against the Axis powers. A broad consideration of the nature of guerrilla warfare helps unravel this curiosity. Byron Farwell explains, guerrillas by themselves cannot win wars, not in the military sense. They can hope that in time their strength will increase to the point where they can put orthodox armies in the field to defeat their enemies in conventional battles. They can hope to so wear down, annoy, and exasperate their foes that they will wring concessions from them, or they can hope for foreign intervention. The Boers had little hope of again amassing an army sizable enough to face the British in open battle. Nor was there any reasonable hope of London relenting, nor of foreign intervention. The Irish wore down Britain, a nation already wearied by the Great War. Gubbins organized the intervention of a foreign power, Britain, and conventional forces to buoy guerrillas on the European continent. But the Afrikaners, skilled practitioners of guerrilla tactics though they were, failed to translate those tactics into victory. Nevertheless, that the IRA and SOE were inspired by the Afrikaners may be their greatest tribute. Thank you.
That was Aaron Linderman, and his paper was on Afrikaner influence on the IRA and SOE. Talking points should include determining the re-influence of the Afrikaner on the IRA and SOE tactics. That's very, very important. How did this determine, for example, the nature, character, and dimensions of the activities of the IRA and then the SOS? You also want to ask, want to determine you also want to find out whether the Afrikaner have a tradition of resistance that merits replication by the IRA and then the SOS. And finally, how would this explain conventional tactics that insurgents use in resistance movement, as you may want to interrogate? So these are areas that I think we will need to bear at the back of our mind. On that note, let me quickly invite our third and for now last presenter. It's supposed to have been a paper that would have been taken yesterday, but we are taking it today. Cadet G. Plotner, and he's doing a paper on sources for success, comparison of the King's African Rifles in the Second World War and the Marmara Revolution. Thank you very much. You have 15 minutes.
So, as was mentioned, I was supposed to be presenting yesterday in the Africa and the World Wars panel, but I believe that my paper can also provide lessons for terrorism, as I address World War II and the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya in the 1950s, which was viewed as a homegrown terrorism insurgency event. So I believe there's still lessons that can be applied and discussed by the group here afterwards. So first I'm going to describe briefly what led me to writing a paper about the King's African Rifles during those two separate engagements. First, I believe that the KAR is pretty important in the development of Kenyan nationalism after independence. Because in a colony where the British government had segregated different ethnicities and tribal groups, the King's African Rifles provided an opportunity for members of those different ethnic groups to come together, and it formed kind of a melting pot where they could learn about each other and kind of breed nationalism within the KAR, which then they were able to take back to their respective areas after their times in the KAR. So my question specifically was which engagement, the operations in World War II and then the operations during the Mau Mau emergency, was more successful for the King's African Rifles, and why? I determined that their deployment during the Second World War was more successful for a variety of reasons, which I'll touch on as I get to my paper. And finally, I believe that the lessons learned from this comparison and the application is important to us today as we move from more of the conventional fighting wars fought by large military forces to more of a terrorism and counterinsurgency mindset amongst violence today. So to start out, I'm going to be describing engagements in World War II. The King's African Rifles was engaged in 3 major campaigns. The first was in Abyssinia in East Africa against the Italian forces in Italian Somaliland. The second campaign was on Madagascar against the Vichy French forces, and the third campaign was in Burma against the Japanese army. So those are 3 very different environments and 3 very different enemies, but all the missions were the same. In each case, the King's African Rifles operated as the spearhead of the British colonial military, and they were given the mission of penetrating through large distances across enemy terrain to capture the command and control centers where the generals were making all the decisions, and take that land and the ability to fight away from the enemy. So in Abyssinia, the King's African Rifles operated in close operations with the South African military. They used the armored elements of the South Africans to provide mobility to the King's African Rifles. And then they were pretty self-contained. They had their own fuel, their own ammunition, their own food, and they were able to operate as independent cells in what's known as ribbon warfare, when basically the units would just operate independently of the larger army with the task of penetrating as far as they can through enemy terrain. So the King's African Rifles were unique from most other colonial militaries in that they had specific bush units who would operate off of the beaten path and the roads that were intersecting through the terrain. These bush units were comprised largely of African Askari forces led by British officers. And it's important here to note that the Askari forces from the British colonial military were different than the ones employed by the Italian forces. And in the Italian forces, their defense was largely focused on using major land features such as rivers and mountain passes to defend large areas of terrain and then fall back to the next major land feature, which in some cases was hundreds of miles away. So as the British forces led by the King's African Rifles was able to penetrate through these defenses, they encountered stiff defense from the Italian forces in very few locations, which was then their drive was characterized by long periods of no contact when they would just move forward to the next major defense presented by the Italians. So I won't bore you with the details of the campaign, but it's important to note that at this point, the Italian campaign was one of the longest and fastest drives of a grand campaign in the history of warfare to that point. The King's African Rifles covered over 1,000 miles in just a 2-month period, which is pretty significant if you think of all the assets and all of the different aspects of that operation and the long supply lines that they had to maintain and defend. After their success in Abyssinia in 1941, the King's African Rifles was determined to lead the offensive against the Vichy French forces on Madagascar. Madagascar presented a threat to the British operations in the Indian Ocean because of their close ties and their familiarity with the Japanese forces. They provided a base for naval submarines of the Japanese to engage and destroy British shipping and military forces in the Indian Ocean. So in 1942, the British decided that they needed to take Madagascar and remove that threat. This was the first time the King's African Rifles was engaged in a naval assault, and they operated again in close contact with South African forces. In the campaign in Madagascar, the French exhibited a similar yet different defense to the Italian forces. The French were fighting a more organized defense, and they employed obstacles and constantly attempted to harass the King's African Rifles as they drove forward again as the tip of the spear of the British military. However, the KAR was specifically well suited to this engagement because, as mentioned before, they were self-sustaining and carried many of their own supplies. They also operated under the independent leadership of lower-level officers who were able to take their mission, which was to drive to those command and control centers, and achieve it without being given specific guidance from their higher commanders. The King's African Rifles were successful in tandem with the South African militaries, as mentioned before, in driving the Vichy French forces from the major areas in Madagascar and then forcing a surrender. So those were the 2 campaigns the first two of World War II of the King's African Rifles, and they were two successes. In both cases, the King's African Rifles succeeded in driving the enemy from their territory and removing their ability to fight a war. The campaign in Burma against the Japanese in 1944 was different in various regards. The first is the defense exhibited by the Japanese was different than that by the Italians or the French. The Japanese didn't believe in surrender and they didn't believe in retreat. And as they fought their way south through Burma as the British fought their way south, the Japanese put up stiff defenses constantly through terrain that was different than in anything in Africa. For the first time, the KAR was fighting in dense forests and swamplands, hemmed in by mountains and facing multiple river crossings and streams which served to impede their forward progress. In addition, the Japanese placed obstacles, but unlike the French, they didn't cover them from a distance with indirect and direct fire. They instead would hide, as some people may be familiar, underground in booby-trapped areas, waiting for those forces to come upon them, and then they would spring ambushes on the forces, on the African forces. So this was a unique type of engagement for the King's African Rifles, something that they'd never been faced before. And in this scenario, the King's African Rifles did not achieve a decisive victory, and they instead continued to fight the campaign until an armistice was signed with Japan in 1945 and 1946, which ended hostilities. Finally, the soldiers were repatriated back to Africa in 1946. So the second engagement I looked at was the counterinsurgency fought against the Mau Mau rebellion in the 1950s. As a brief background to the Mau Mau rebellion for people not familiar with it, it was largely an ethnic revolt by the Kikuyu tribe in Kenya against the British government. Mau Mau was different than most other wars fought to that point because they couldn't identify a clear enemy. The Kikuyu blended in with most of the civilian population, and they presented challenges to the government in a way that hadn't really been seen before by the British in that area. So at the outbreak of the emergency, there were only 2 battalions of the King's African Rifles present in Kenya at that time. This is significant because that's a very small number of troops when you think about the degree to which they'd been previously involved. Each battalion consists of a few companies, which in turn consist of a few hundred men at the most. So there were less than 1,000 soldiers present in Kenya at the time. They were operating as a constabulary force, helping the police really put down whatever disturbances happened to be present in the region. They weren't really geared towards fighting against the counterinsurgency. So at the outbreak, the British government decided to bring in 3 more battalions from areas in Nyasaland, further north in British Somaliland, and down in present-day Tanzania as well. So all those forces moved into Kenya to help fight against the emergency. The colonial government segregated members of the population. They would form these protected areas in which they would concentrate the population, leaving large areas of the countryside open. The intent here was that they would provide the enemy insurgents no areas to really hide. If there was no one supposed to be in the countryside, they would assume that anyone in the countryside was a rebel. There were multiple side effects to this, which the British colonial government didn't really foresee. As I mentioned before, it was difficult to distinguish the Mau Mau rebels from the civilian population. This became especially difficult when everyone in the countryside was concentrated in these protected areas, because the rebels didn't play by the rules and they wouldn't stay in the countryside to be identified. They would stay with the civilian populations. So the King's African Rifles was employed in a few major types of operations during Mau Mau. The first was to assist the Kenyan police, who was the main effort of the operations. They would assist the Kenyan police in cordon and search operations in the protected areas, where the King's African Rifles would perform security operations, ringing the areas, making sure no one could get in or out, while the Kenyan police performed the actual searching and identifying of the Mau Mau rebels. The second operations were patrols through the countryside and through the white settled areas to catch cattle thieves and other terrorist gangs, as they were called by the British forces. And the third and final type of operations which the King's African Rifles were engaged in was specifically their realm, was the destruction and elimination of all terrorist forces as identified by intelligence and previous actions. So between 1953 and 1955, the KAR was largely involved in defensive operations, which is not something that they'd been involved in any of their previous campaigns. before World War I and after World War I, they fought against the Mad Mullah in Somaliland, offensive operations. The 3 campaigns in World War II were offensive operations. This deployment against Mau Mau as a defensive operation was characteristically different than anything that they'd been involved in before. In 1955, however, the military leadership in Kenya changed, and the new leadership determined that a more direct offensive approach needed to be taken against the Mau Mau rebels to solve the problem. They developed special operations tactics and teams within the KAR designed specifically to rout out insurgents and terrorist forces. Namely, one of these were the tracker teams developed by the KAR, which would consist of 15 to 20 individuals specifically trained in Mau Mau tactics and forest warfare. And their purpose was to work with the locals and identify specific targets and seek them out and eliminate them. This was a different development from the defensive operations that had previously been undertaken over the first 2 years. So throughout 1955 and 1956, this change in tactics and a focus towards special operations succeeded in largely routing out large members of the Mau Mau. And in 1956, the KAR was able to turn these operations over to the Kenyan police, and then operating again largely in security fashions. So as some of you may know, in 1956, the rebellion petered off and finally came to an end with Kenyan independence when the rebels were reconciled with the rest of the government under Jomo Kenyatta. So in analyzing these 2 campaigns, I sought to determine the sources for success in World War II as opposed to during Mau Mau, and I determined that there were a few specific reasons why the KAR was more successful during World War II. And the first was the organizational deployment. Instead of operating in Mau Mau as they did with small units, during World War II, the King's African Rifles deployed in battalion and higher strength. So there were large numbers of forces, and they were matched against specific enemies that were very similar. They were fighting against the colonial militaries of the Italians, the French, and the Japanese, who had similar missions, tactics to what the KAR was fighting with. In addition, they were able to coordinate pretty closely with the armor, artillery, and air assets of their own military, which were not very present during the Mau Mau Rebellion. A second source was the enemy, as mentioned before. When they were fighting in World War II, it was clearly identifiable who their opponents were. They were European armies, colonial forces, that were very identifiable. Large troop formations in clear defensive positions. During Mau Mau, it was, as I mentioned before, very difficult to distinguish the insurgents from the rest of the civilian population. A third source for success were the tactics that they used. The training of the King's African Rifles was really geared towards war fighting. Large movements under fire, coordination with different branches of the air armor and artillery assets, and those long drives through enemy terrain. During Mau Mau, they didn't really develop successful tactics until the first 2 years of the emergency had already passed. I determined that the King's African Rifles were more successful in World War II because of their organization, the enemy they fought, and the tactics that they used. It's important, I believe, at this point to look and see if there's anything that we can learn today fighting similar insurgencies, and maybe learn lessons that the King's African Rifles learned in the 1950s towards engaging these enemy forces. For example, the integration of multiple approaches using the Kenyan police as the main effort, operations in tandem with the Kikuyu Guard, the militia forces, and really state-run, government-led operations to root out an insurgency on multiple efforts, not just on military terms. I believe that there are multiple lessons that if we study the engagement of this counterinsurgency by the King's African Rifles, that forces today can learn from them and fight against insurgency and terrorism in a more successful manner. So that's all I have at this point. I'll turn it back over.